In the gleaming towers of Manhattan's financial district, a brilliant executive was about to face her greatest enemy. What started as a routine charity gala took a shocking turn when she came face to face with the mentor who had destroyed her career 2 years earlier. Rachel Davidson wasn't your typical corporate consultant. For 24 months, she had spent her life meticulously planning the downfall of Marcus Sterling, known for her strategic brilliance and unwavering determination. When she encountered her former boss at the Blackstone Financial Summit, she had no idea the final battle would cost her everything she thought she wanted, including her own soul. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rachel Davidson's fingers traced the edge of the email confirmation on her screen, savoring each word like fine wine. Marcus Sterling has confirmed his attendance at the annual Financial Leaders Summit. The cursor blinked steadily in the corner, waiting, just as she had been waiting for 2 years, 7 months, and 13 days. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office on the 42nd floor, Manhattan sprawled beneath her like a conquered kingdom. The Davidson Walsh Consulting logo gleamed in brushed steel letters behind her desk, a monument to what she'd built from the ashes of her former life. But monuments, she'd learned, were cold comfort compared to the warmth of revenge. She closed her eyes and let herself remember, "You'll never succeed without me." The words echoed across time, carrying with them the scent of Marcus's expensive cologne and the taste of her own tears. 2 years ago, she'd stood in his mahogany-paneled office at Blackstone Financial, her resignation letter trembling in her hands like a white flag of surrender. "You think you can just walk away?" Marcus had said, not even looking up from his computer screen. His fingers continued their relentless typing, each keystroke a dismissal. "After everything I've taught you, everything I've made you, I've earned my place here." Rachel had whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the city 40 floors below. "Those deals, those clients. I built those relationships." That's when he'd finally looked at her. His gray eyes, once warm with mentorship, had turned to Arctic steel. "Those relationships belong to me. Those clients trust Marcus Sterling, not some ambitious little girl from Ohio who thinks she's smarter than her teacher." The humiliation had been swift and surgical. Within a week, every client she'd cultivated had been pulled away, their contracts mysteriously renegotiated. Her colleagues, people she'd considered friends, began avoiding her calls. Industry contacts suddenly found themselves too busy to meet. Marcus had wielded his influence like a scalpel, cutting away her professional network with precision that bordered on artistry. The final blow had come during her last day. Marcus had summoned her to his office one final time, ostensibly to discuss her transition. Instead, he'd handed her a letter of recommendation, so damning in its faint praise that it read like a professional obituary. "Remember this moment," he'd said, his voice soft with false sympathy. "Remember that everything you achieved here was because I allowed it. You're nothing but my creation, Rachel. And without me, you'll discover just how little that creation is worth." She'd left Blackstone that day, carrying only a cardboard box of personal items and a burning certainty that she would prove him wrong. What she hadn't expected was how much proving him wrong would change her. A soft knock interrupted her reverie. "Rachel, do you have a minute?" Jennifer Walsh stood in the doorway, her auburn hair catching the afternoon light. Where Rachel favored sharp, structured suits that made her look like she could cut glass, Jennifer dressed with the understated elegance of someone who'd learned that true power rarely needed to announce itself. "Of course." Rachel minimized the email and gestured to the chairs across from her desk. "How did the Morrison presentation go?" "They signed." Jennifer settled into the chair with the satisfied smile of someone who'd just closed a 7-figure deal. "Full consulting package, 18-month timeline. They specifically requested you lead the strategic restructuring." "Excellent." Rachel felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest, the satisfaction of legitimate success. It was a feeling she'd almost forgotten in the shadow of her other pursuits. "That puts us ahead of our Q3 projections, by 30%. Jennifer's smile faded slightly as she studied Rachel's face. "You know, we should celebrate. When was the last time you took an evening off?" actually took time to enjoy what we've built here. Rachel's fingers drummed against her desk, a nervous habit she'd developed in the months after leaving Blackstone. Success is its own celebration. Jennifer leaned forward, her voice taking on the gentle firmness that had made her an exceptional compliance officer in her previous life. Because sometimes I look at you and I see someone who's forgotten how to enjoy victory. You've been working 16-hour days for months. Rach, even our competitors are starting to whisper about the workaholic who never sleeps. Let them whisper. Rachel stood and walked to the window, her reflection ghost-like against the cityscape. Every hour I work is an hour closer to proving that they were all wrong about me. Who was wrong about you? The question hung in the air like smoke. Rachel could see Jennifer's reflection in the window, waiting patiently for an answer that would never come. How could she explain that every success felt hollow until Marcus Sterling acknowledged it? How could she admit that she'd built this empire not for herself, but as a weapon pointed directly at the heart of the man who'd tried to destroy her? Everyone, Rachel said finally. Everyone who counted me out. After Jennifer left, Rachel locked her office door and pressed her palm against a hidden biometric scanner beside her bookshelf. The panel slid aside with a whisper, revealing a room that officially didn't exist. She'd had it built during the office renovation, claiming it as climate-controlled storage for sensitive documents. That wasn't entirely a lie. The war room was sparse, almost monastic in its dedication to a single purpose. 3 walls were covered in documents, photographs, and connection maps that told the story of Marcus Sterling's empire in meticulous detail. Financial records obtained through careful cultivation of former Blackstone employees, photographs taken by private investigators she'd hired through shell companies, email chains forwarded by allies she'd placed strategically throughout the industry. At the center of it all hung a photograph of Marcus from last year's Financial Excellence Awards ceremony. He stood at the podium, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile radiating the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Rachel had stared at that photograph for hours, memorizing every line of his face until she could conjure his image in perfect detail. She moved to the evidence wall, her fingers trailing over bank routing numbers and shell company registrations. 2 years of investigation had revealed a web of financial misconduct that would make even seasoned prosecutors salivate. Money laundering through overseas accounts, tax evasion schemes hidden in labyrinthine corporate structures, a pattern of harassment and intimidation that stretched back over a decade. But evidence without a delivery mechanism was just paper. She needed the perfect moment, the perfect venue, the perfect confluence of circumstances to ensure that Marcus's fall would be as public and devastating as her own had been private and surgical. Her phone buzzed. A text from David Chen. Found something you'll want to see. Can we meet tomorrow? Rachel's pulse quickened. David had been investigating Marcus for 3 years, long before she'd made contact. His persistence in pursuing financial corruption stories had made him the perfect ally and the perfect weapon. If he'd found something new, something that could complete her arsenal, she typed back, Brooklyn Heights Promenade, 7 a.m. Tomorrow she would collect the final piece of her puzzle. In 3 weeks, at the Financial Leaders Summit, she would set her plan in motion. Marcus Sterling had promised her that she'd never succeed without him. He was about to discover just how wrong a man could be. The city lights twinkled below like stars, distant and cold. Rachel pressed her forehead against the window, feeling the glass cool against her skin. Somewhere out there, Marcus was probably enjoying dinner at his exclusive club, surrounded by admirers and acolytes who hung on his every word. He had no idea that his former protege was about to become his executioner. The thought should have filled her with satisfaction. Instead, she felt only the familiar emptiness that had lived in her chest since the day she'd walked out of Blackstone Financial. Victory would fill that void. It had to, because if it didn't, Rachel wasn't sure what would be left of the woman she used to be. The Brooklyn Heights Promenade stretched before Rachel like a bridge between worlds. On one side, Manhattan's glass towers caught the morning sun, their surfaces gleaming with the promise of another day's conquests. On the other, the harbor spread wide and gray, patient as a grave. She found David Chen exactly where she expected, leaning against the railing with a coffee in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. You're early, he said without turning around. Punctuality is a virtue. Rachel moved to stand beside him, close enough to catch the scent of his cologne mixed with newsprint and ambition. What do you have for me? David studied her profile for a moment before answering. His dark eyes held the intensity of someone who'd spent years chasing truth through the shadows of financial districts and corporate boardrooms. Cayman Islands banking records. Took me 6 months to cultivate the source. Another 3 to verify authenticity. He handed her the envelope. Rachel's fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, a reaction that annoyed her. She'd trained herself to be steel, but David had always been able to find the hairline cracks in her armor. The documents inside made her breath catch. Account numbers, transfer records, timestamps that painted a picture of systematic money laundering spanning 5 years. Marcus hadn't just been skimming profits. He'd been running a full-scale operation, washing money for clients whose names read like a who's who of international corruption. She paused, recalculating everything. This is bigger than tax evasion. This is RICO territory. $23 million moved through shell companies in the last 18 months alone. David's voice carried the satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. Your boy Marcus has been very busy since you left Blackstone. Rachel closed the envelope carefully, as if it contained explosives rather than paper. In a way it did. When can you publish? That's what I wanted to discuss. David turned to face her fully, his expression growing serious. Rachel, I need to know what's your endgame here, because this story is going to destroy more than just Marcus Sterling. The question hung between them like a challenge. Rachel had always known this moment would come, when David would demand to understand her true motivation. She'd prepared for it, rehearsed the righteous indignation of a whistleblower, seeking justice, but standing here, looking into eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed facades, the words felt thin as paper. Marcus Sterling is a criminal, she said instead. The world deserves to know. That's not an answer. David stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. I've been watching you for 18 months, Rachel. I've seen how you work, how you think. This isn't about justice for you. This is personal. A seagull cried overhead, sharp and piercing. Rachel felt exposed under David's gaze, as if he could see all the way down to the festering wound that Marcus's betrayal had left in her soul. Does it matter? She asked. If the outcome is the same, it matters to me. His voice softened, because somewhere along the way, I started caring about what happens to you after this is over, and I'm afraid you haven't thought that far ahead. The confession hit her like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on Marcus's destruction that she'd forgotten about the collateral damage, including the man standing beside her. David had been investigating financial corruption long before she'd entered his life, but she'd twisted his noble pursuit into a weapon for her personal vendetta. I need this story published, she said quietly, timed to coincide with the Financial Leaders Summit. Can you do that? David was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to memorize it. Finally, he nodded. I'll need 2 weeks to verify sources and build the narrative. But Rachel, he reached out and touched her hand, his fingers warm against her cold skin. Promise me, you'll be careful. Men like Marcus Sterling don't go down quietly. I can handle Marcus. I'm not worried about him. David's thumb traced across her knuckle. I'm worried about what this revenge is doing to you. The woman I first met was brilliant and driven, but she was also kind. Lately, I see something else in your eyes, something harder. Rachel pulled her hand away, the contact suddenly unbearable. People change. They don't have to. After David left, Rachel remained on the promenade, watching the morning joggers and dog walkers begin their daily routines. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the weight of carefully plotted vengeance. She envied them their simplicity, even as she despised their naivety. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. We need to talk. Elena Rodriguez. The woman had been radio silent for 3 months, despite Rachel's careful cultivation of their relationship. Elena was the key to everything, the one person whose testimony could corroborate the pattern of abuse that ran like a poisonous thread through Marcus's career. Rachel typed back, Where? Lincoln Center, near the fountain. 1 hour. The subway ride into Manhattan gave Rachel time to prepare. Elena was fragile, traumatized by her experience with Marcus and terrified of the legal machinery that had silenced her. Approaching her required delicacy, the kind of emotional manipulation that would have disgusted the woman Rachel used to. She found Elena sitting on a bench near the fountain, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that did nothing to hide the exhaustion in her eyes. 3 years ago, Elena had been a rising star in Blackstone's analysis department. Now she taught high school mathematics in Queens, her dreams of financial success buried under layers of NDAs and trauma. "Thank you for meeting me," Rachel said, settling beside her on the bench. "I shouldn't be here." Elena's voice was barely audible above the splash of water. "If he finds out." "He won't." Rachel kept her tone gentle, suppressing the urgency that clawed at her chest. "Elena, I know what he did to you. I know how he made you feel small and helpless and alone, but you have the power to stop him from doing it to anyone else." Elena's hands shook as she reached into her purse. "I kept copies," she whispered, "of the emails, the settlement agreement, everything. I don't know why. Maybe I always knew this day would come." She handed Rachel a flash drive, her fingers trembling. "There's another girl now, Sarah something. I see her sometimes at industry events, and she has that same look I used to have, that blind adoration, that trust." Rachel's stomach twisted. Sarah Mitchell, Marcus's current protégé, the bright-eyed MBA student, who reminded Rachel so painfully of her younger self. The girl was walking into the same trap Rachel had escaped, following the same path that had led Elena to ruin. "We can protect her," Rachel said, "but I need you to go on record, officially." "I can't." Elena stood abruptly, her composure cracking. "You don't understand what it was like. The lawyers, the depositions, the way they made me feel like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I won't go through that again. Elena, please." "No." Elena turned to face her, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I've given you what I can. Use it however you want, but leave me out of it. I can't be your weapon, Rachel. I've been broken enough for one lifetime." She walked away before Rachel could respond, disappearing into the crowd of tourists and commuters. Rachel sat alone by the fountain, clutching the flash drive like a talisman. Elena's words echoed in her mind. "I can't be your weapon." Was that what she'd become? A collector of weapons, a gatherer of ammunition for a war that only she wanted to fight? David's concerns suddenly seemed less like overprotectiveness, and more like prophecy. Her phone rang. Jennifer's name appeared on the screen. "Where are you?" Jennifer's voice carried an edge of irritation. "The Hartwell people are here for their 10 o'clock and they specifically asked for you." Rachel checked her watch. She'd been sitting by the fountain for over an hour, lost in thoughts that led nowhere productive. "I'm on my way, Rachel." Jennifer's voice softened. "Is everything okay? You've been distracted lately, and I'm starting to worry." "Everything's fine." The lie came easily now, smooth as silk and twice as artificial. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." But as she stood to leave, Rachel caught her reflection in the fountain's surface, distorted by the moving water, fragmented into pieces that couldn't quite fit together. "David was right,"
Rachel asked casually. Sarah's face went pale. "How did you?" "The private dining room on the 61st floor. He calls it his thinking space, doesn't he? Says the view helps him see the bigger picture." Rachel watched Sarah's composure crack, recognizing the moment when illusion met reality. "Let me guess, he told you it was a special privilege, something he only shared with his most promising protégés." "It's not, it's professional," Sarah stammered, but doubt flickered in her eyes. "We discuss strategy, market analysis. While he stands behind your chair, just close enough to make you uncomfortable but not close enough to call it harassment." Rachel's voice remained gentle, but each word was a surgical strike. "And when you tense up, he tells you that success requires being comfortable with powerful men, that you need to learn to navigate these situations if you want to survive in his world." Sarah's champagne glass trembled in her hand. "You don't understand. He's helping me. He's grooming you." The words came out harsher than Rachel intended, but she couldn't stop herself. just like he groomed Elena Rodriguez. Just like he groomed me. You think you're special, that your relationship with him is different, but you're just the latest in a very long line. You're wrong. Sarah's voice cracked with the desperation of someone whose world was tilting off its axis. Marcus believes in me. He sees my potential. He sees your vulnerability. Rachel stepped closer, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Sarah, listen to me. Whatever he's promised you, whatever he's made you believe about yourself, it's a lie. He doesn't build people up. He tears them down and rebuilds them in his image. And when you're no longer useful, when you start to question him, or show too much independence, he'll destroy you so completely that you'll wonder if you ever had any talent at all. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but her chin remained defiant. Even if that were true, what would you have me do? Walk away from the best opportunity I've ever had. Throw away my career because some bitter ex-employee is spreading rumors. The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to wound. Rachel was bitter. She was spreading information that could be construed as rumor, and she was asking this young woman to sacrifice everything Rachel herself had been too weak to sacrifice years ago. Marcus Sterling is going down, Rachel said quietly. In 2 weeks at the Financial Leaders Summit, the truth about him is going to come out. When it does, you need to be as far away from him as possible, or you'll be buried in the rubble. Are you threatening me? I'm trying to save you. Rachel reached into her clutch and pulled out a business card. When you're ready to hear the truth, the real truth, not the version Marcus has fed you, call me. Sarah stared at the card as if it were a live grenade. Why? Why do you care what happens to me? The question caught Rachel off guard. Why did she care? Sarah Mitchell was nothing to her, a stranger whose only connection was their shared misfortune of trusting the wrong mentor. By any logical measure, Sarah was collateral damage in a war that had started long before she'd entered the picture. But looking at her now, seeing the fear and confusion and desperate hope in her eyes, Rachel remembered what it felt like to believe that someone powerful saw worth in you. She remembered the intoxicating feeling of being chosen, of being special, of mattering to someone who seemed to matter to everyone, because someone should have warned me, Rachel said finally, and because you remind me of who I used to be. Before I learned that trust was a luxury I couldn't afford. A commotion near the stage interrupted them. Marcus Sterling had taken the podium, his silver hair gleaming under the ballroom light. He was larger than life in his tuxedo, commanding attention with the ease of someone born to it. When he smiled, the room seemed to brighten. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried effortlessly across the ballroom. Tonight we celebrate not just our contributions to worthy causes, but the mentorship that shapes our industry's future. I'm proud to introduce my current protégé, a young woman whose brilliance and dedication remind me why I entered this business in the first place. Rachel felt sick as she realized what was happening. Marcus gestured toward their corner of the room, his eyes finding Sarah with predatory precision. Sarah Mitchell, everyone, the future of Blackstone Financial. The applause was thunderous. Sarah straightened, her earlier doubt forgotten in the rush of public recognition. She moved toward the stage like a woman in a trance, and Rachel saw with crystal clarity how this would end. Sarah would bask in Marcus's reflected glory, would convince herself that their private meetings were mentorship rather than manipulation, would become so invested in the fantasy that she'd defend him even when the truth became undeniable, just as Rachel had done, until it was too late. Marcus's eyes found Rachel across the room, and for one electric moment, they stared at each other across the sea of Manhattan's elite. His smile never wavered, but something cold and calculating flickered in his gaze. He knew she was there. He'd probably known all along, and he'd just shown her exactly how he planned to use Sarah Mitchell as both weapon and shield in the war that was coming. The applause died down as Sarah reached the stage, her face glowing with pride and vindication. Marcus placed a proprietary hand on her shoulder, the gesture perfectly calibrated to appear supportive while marking his territory. Rachel set down her champagne glass and walked toward the exit, her business card abandoned on the auction table where Sarah had dropped. Behind her, Marcus's voice continued to weave its spell over another generation of ambitious young minds. The battle lines were drawn. In 2 weeks, at the Financial Leaders Summit, the war would begin in earnest. But as Rachel stepped into the cool Manhattan night, She couldn't shake the image of Sarah's face, so young, so hopeful, so utterly unprepared for what was coming. Some victories, Rachel was beginning to understand, felt an awful lot like defeat. The Sterling and Associates office occupied a modest floor in a midtown building that aspired to grandeur but settled for respectability. Unlike the gleaming corporate towers that housed Blackstone Financial, this space felt lived in, human scale. Family photographs lined the reception desk, and children's drawings were pinned to a bulletin board beside quarterly report. It was exactly the kind of place Rachel would have dismissed 2 years ago as quaint, and exactly the kind of place that now made her stomach twist with something uncomfortably close to guilt. Richard Sterling rose from behind his desk as she entered, and the resemblance to Marcus was immediately apparent. They shared the same strong jaw and intelligent eyes, but where Marcus radiated predatory charm, Richard projected something softer: competence without arrogance, success without cruelty. When he smiled, it reached his eyes. "Ms. Davidson, thank you for coming. I have to admit, I was surprised when you called." He gestured to a chair across from his desk, his movements economical and unpretentious. "Can I get you coffee? Tea?" "Coffee would be lovely." Rachel settled into the chair, her designer suit feeling suddenly overdressed for the environment. She'd spent an hour that morning selecting the perfect outfit for this meeting, professional enough to be taken seriously, feminine enough to seem non-threatening. The calculation of it all made her feel like a predator dressed as prey. Richard poured coffee from a simple carafe, his hands steady and sure. Everything about him suggested integrity, from his rolled-up sleeves to the wedding ring he unconsciously twisted when thinking. The kind of man who probably coached his children's soccer teams and remembered his wedding anniversary without calendar reminders. "So," he said, settling back into his chair, "you mentioned wanting to discuss potential collaboration between our firms. I'll be honest, I did some research after your call. Davidson Walsh has an impressive track record. What made you think of us?" The lie came smoothly, rehearsed and polished. "We're looking to expand our advisory services into family business consulting. Your firm has built an excellent reputation in that space, particularly with succession planning. I thought there might be synergies we could explore." Richard's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "That's fascinating. Family businesses are really my passion. There's something beautiful about helping multiple generations work together instead of tearing each other apart. Though I imagine you see plenty of that in your corporate consult." "More than I'd like," Rachel admitted, and was surprised to find the honesty felt good. There's something to be said for businesses built on relationships rather than quarterly targets. "Exactly," Richard leaned forward, animated. "Don't get me wrong, profits matter. We're not running a charity, but when you're dealing with family legacies, with businesses that span generations, you have to think beyond the next earnings report. You have to consider the human cost of every decision." The phrase hit Rachel like a physical blow. The human cost. She thought of Sarah Mitchell's face at the gala, the hope slowly draining from her eyes as Rachel's warnings sank in. She thought of Elena Rodriguez, broken and traumatized, teaching high school math because the financial world had become too toxic to survive. She thought of David Chen, risking his career to help her pursue a vendetta that grew darker with each passing day. "That's a luxury not everyone can afford," she said carefully. "Is it?" Richard's brow furrowed. "I mean, I understand the pressure, believe me. I've felt it. My brother Marcus is always telling me I'm too soft, too concerned with making everyone happy. But at the end of the day, I have to sleep at night. I have to look my wife and kids in the eye and know that I've done right by people." There it was, the opening she'd been waiting for. Rachel felt like a hunter who'd finally cornered her prey, except the prey was offering itself up willingly, trusting in her humanity. "Your brother works in a different environment. Corporate finance can be ruthless." Richard's expression darkened slightly. "You know Marcus. We worked together at Blackstone." Briefly, Rachel watched Richard's face carefully, looking for any sign of what he knew about his brother's true nature. "It was an educational experience. Marcus has always been complicated." Richard's voice carried the weight of a lifetime of difficult conversations. "Brilliant. Absolutely. Successful beyond anyone's wildest dreams. But sometimes I worry about the methods he uses to achieve that success." Rachel's pulse quickened. "What kind of meth?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his coffee cup. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. There are rumors, stories about how he treats employees, particularly the women. His assistants never last long, and when they leave, they look diminished somehow. Have you confronted him about it? How do you confront someone about rumors, about feelings and impressions? Richard's frustration was evident. Marcus would just tell me I'm being naive, that I don't understand how his world works, and maybe he'd be right. Maybe I am too soft for corporate finance. Rachel leaned forward, sensing vulnerability. What if they weren't just rumors? What if you had proof that your brother was engaging in illegal activities? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Richard's face went pale, and for a moment, Rachel saw the exact moment when trust began to crumble. Ms. Davidson, he said slowly, is this really about business collaboration? The directness of the question caught her off guard. She'd expected deflection, denial, the kind of willful blindness that family loyalty often produced. Instead, Richard was looking at her with the clear eyes of someone who'd been dreading this conversation for years. Your brother destroyed my career 2 years ago, she said quietly. Systematically undermined every relationship I'd built, poisoned every professional connection I had. He told me I'd never succeed without him. Richard closed his eyes. Jesus, I've rebuilt my life, my business, my reputation, but I can't rebuild the trust I lost in other people, in mentorship, in the basic decency of professional relationships. Rachel felt tears threatening and pushed them back. This wasn't the time for weakness. Marcus is a predator, Richard, and he's grooming another young woman right now. Sarah Mitchell. Richard's voice was hollow. I've met her a few times. She reminds me of my daughter, actually. Bright, ambitious, believes the best in people. She's going to end up just like the others unless someone stops him. Richard stood abruptly and walked to the window, his shoulders tense. You want me to turn against my brother, to help you destroy him? I want you to help me expose the truth. Rachel joined him at the window, looking out at the modest view of Midtown Manhattan. I have evidence, Rich, financial records, witness testimony, a pattern of behavior that goes back years. Your brother isn't just morally bankrupt, he's criminally liable. And what about my family? Richard turned to face her, his eyes blazing with sudden anger. What about my wife and children? What happens to them when Marcus goes down and takes Sterling and Associates with him? Because make no mistake, if my brother falls, the collateral damage will be enormous. Rachel felt the familiar coldness settle over her, the emotional distance that had become her armor. Sometimes innocent people get hurt in the pursuit of justice. Listen to yourself. Richard's voice was sharp now, cutting through her detachment. You sound exactly like him, like Marcus. Sometimes people get hurt, that's his philosophy, not yours, or at least I hope it's not yours. The comparison hit like a slap. Rachel saw herself suddenly, through Richard's eyes, a woman so consumed with revenge, that she was willing to destroy an innocent family to achieve it. The realization was nauseating. I'm not like him, she said, but the words felt hollow. Aren't? Richard returned to his desk and pulled out a file folder. I've been doing my own investigation, Miss Davidson, into you, into your business practices, into the methods you've used to rebuild your career. You're very good at finding people's weaknesses and exploiting them. David, Chen, Elena Rodriguez, you've turned them all into weapons in your war against Marcus. Rachel felt exposed, vulnerable. They chose to help me, did they, or did you manipulate them into it? Richard opened the folder and spread photographs across his desk. Pictures of her meeting with David at the promenade, with Elena at Lincoln Center, entering the Blackstone gala. You're not seeking justice, Miss Davidson, you're seeking revenge, and revenge has a way of consuming everything in its path. The photos stared up at her like accusation. Richard had been watching her, investigating her, just as she'd been investigating Marcus. The symmetry was uncomfortable. Your brother is a criminal, she said again, but the conviction was leaking out of her voice. Maybe he is, probably he is. Richard gathered the photographs and returned them to the folder. But you're asking me to choose between my family and justice, and I'm not sure the justice you're offering is worth the price you're demanding. Rachel felt the meeting slipping away from her, her carefully laid plans crumbling in the face of Richard's unexpected resistance. She'd counted on his guilt, his obvious discomfort with Marcus's methods. She hadn't counted on his strength. "Think about Sarah Mitchell," she said desperately. "Think about all the other women who will come after her. How many more victims is your family's comfort worth?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, his wedding ring catching the afternoon light as he twisted it unconscious. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with a sadness that seemed to age him 10 years. "I'll give you one piece of advice, Miss Davidson. When this is over, when you've gotten your revenge and destroyed my brother, ask yourself what you've become in the process. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like Marcus Sterling has already won. He's turned you into exactly the kind of person he is." Rachel left the Sterling & Associates office with empty hands and a full heart, full of doubt, guilt and the uncomfortable recognition that Richard might be right. She'd come seeking ammunition for her war against Marcus, and instead, found a mirror that reflected an image she didn't recognize. The woman staring back at her looked very much like the monster she'd sworn to destroy. Rachel's hands trembled as she stared at the unexpected email in her inbox. The sender's name made her breath catch. Thomas Blackstone, the founding partner of Blackstone Financial, the man whose vision had built the empire that Marcus now controlled, wanted to meet with her immediately. "Miss Davidson, I believe we have mutual interests to discuss. My office, 4 p.m. today, come alone." TV. The message was vintage Blackstone, direct, imperious, brooking no argument. Rachel glanced at her watch. 3:15 p.m., just enough time to walk the 12 blocks from her office to the towering glass monument that housed her former employer. Richard Sterling's words still echoed in her mind as she made her way through the Manhattan streets. "Marcus has already won. He's turned you into exactly the kind of person he is." The accusation had haunted her for 3 days, seeping into her thoughts like poison. Even her reflection in the Blackstone lobby's polished marble seemed different, harder, more calculating. The executive elevator whisked her to the 48th floor, where Thomas Blackstone's corner office commanded a view that made Manhattan look like a conquered kingdom. At 72, Blackstone remained an imposing figure, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with the kind of presence that could fill a boardroom without saying a word. He gestured for her to sit without looking up from the document he was reviewing. $23 million, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of decades in the industry, laundered through shell companies in the Cayman Islands over the past 18 months. "Your friend, Mr. Chen, is a thorough investigator." Rachel's blood turned to ice. "I don't know what you're talking about." Thomas looked up then, his pale blue eyes holding the sharp intelligence that had built a financial empire from nothing. "Miss Davidson, I've been in this business for 45 years. I can smell a coordinated attack from 3 floors away." David Chen's investigation, Elena Rodriguez, willingness to break her NDA, your sudden interest in industry events, you've avoided for 2 years. It all points to a very specific target. He stood and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back.
"I want you to complete what you've started." Thomas pulled a document from the folder and slid it across the desk. "A contract offering you Marcus's position at Blackstone Financial, senior partner, investment division. Full autonomy, unlimited resources, equity stake, everything you should have had 2 years ago." Rachel stared at the contract without reading it. The numbers would be astronomical. More money than Davidson Walsh could generate in a decade, more power than she'd ever imagined wielding. It was everything she'd dreamed of when she first walked into Blackstone as a naive graduate student. "There's a catch," she said. "There's always a catch." Thomas's smile turned genuinely amused. "You take Marcus's job, you also take responsibility for cleaning up his messes. The shell companies, the questionable clients, the harassment settlements, all of it becomes your problem. Think of it as penance for the methods you've used to get here. And if I refuse, then David Chen publishes his story, Elena Rodriguez testifies, and Marcus goes down anyway. But without institutional support, the investigation might expand. Other former employees might be implicated. Colleagues who helped him, enabled him, or simply looked the other way. The kind of people who might now run successful consulting firms. The threat was elegantly delivered, but unmistakable. Rachel felt the walls closing in, the careful architecture of her revenge collapsing into a trap she hadn't seen coming. "You're blackmailing me. I'm offering you a choice." Thomas stood and moved to a sideboard, pouring himself a glass of whiskey despite the early hour. "Destroy Marcus from the outside and risk everything you've built, or destroy him from the inside and inherit his kingdom. Either way, he falls. The only question is whether you fall with him." Rachel's mind raced through the implications. Taking the job would mean legitimizing Marcus's destruction, turning it from personal vendetta into corporate necessity. It would also mean returning to the place where her professional soul had been murdered, working in the shadow of her own trauma. "Why me?" she asked. "You could hire anyone to clean up Marcus's messes, because you understand the cost of his methods better than anyone, because you've seen what he does to people, and you have the motivation to ensure it never happens again." Thomas returned to his chair, the whiskey forgotten, "And because, despite what you've become in pursuit of revenge, I believe there's still enough of the woman you used to be to do the right thing." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Thomas's assistant entered with an apologetic expression. "Sir, Mr. Sterling is here for his 4:30 appointment. Should I tell him you're running late?" Rachel's blood froze. Marcus was here just outside the door, probably reviewing his talking points for whatever meeting Thomas had scheduled. The symmetry was too perfect to be coincidental. "Send him in," Thomas said calmly. "Miss Davidson and I were just finishing our discussion." "You planned this," Rachel whispered. "I planned everything." Thomas straightened his tie and assumed the mask of genial corporate leadership. "The question is whether you're ready to face the man who made you into what you are." The door opened, and Marcus Sterling strode into the office with the confident bearing of a man who believed himself untouchable. He was talking before he'd fully entered the room. "Tom, I've been thinking about the Morrison account, and I think we need to." He stopped mid-sentence as he saw Rachel, his face cycling through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been fear. "Rachel," her name on his lips sounded like a curse. "What are you doing here?" "Davidson was just leaving," Thomas said smoothly. "We've concluded our business." Rachel stood on unsteady legs, the contract still lying on Thomas's desk like a loaded gun. She had to pass Marcus to reach the door, had to walk within arm's reach of the man who had defined the last 2 years of her life. As she drew level with him, Marcus spoke quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Whatever game you think you're playing, Rachel, remember that I taught you the rules, and I always stay one step ahead of my students." She met his eyes then, seeing for the first time not the monster of her nightmares, but simply a man, arrogant, calculating, but ultimately human, ultimately vulnerable. "You taught me well," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "Perhaps too well." She walked past him without another word, leaving both men to contemplate the implications of what had just transpired. In the elevator, she finally allowed herself to read Thomas's contract offer. The numbers were even more staggering than she'd imagined, but it was the final clause that made her hands shake. All existing non-disclosure agreements with former employees will be declared null and void, and full cooperation with any ongoing investigations will be provided. Thomas wasn't just offering her Marcus's job, he was offering her the chance to free every woman Marcus had silenced, to ensure that his victims could finally speak their truth without fear of legal retribution. The elevator descended toward the lobby, carrying Rachel away from the empire she'd once called home, and toward a choice that would define not just her future but her very soul. Outside, Manhattan pulsed with its usual energy, indifferent to the human dramas playing out in its towers of glass and steel. Rachel stood on the sidewalk, Thomas's contract burning in her purse like a guilty secret. In 1 week, at the Financial Leaders Summit, her carefully orchestrated revenge would reach its crescendo, but now she faced a choice that Marcus Sterling had never offered her years ago: the difference between justice and vengeance, between becoming the monster or slaying it. The question was whether she still remembered how to choose the light. Marcus Sterling's private office felt smaller than it used to, the mahogany walls pressing in like the sides of a coffin. He stood at his window watching the ant-like figures scurrying through the Manhattan streets, 40 floors below, and tried to convince himself that the tightness in his chest was just stress from the upcoming summit presentation. Not paranoia, not fear. The morning had started badly with David Chen's phone call. Mr. Sterling, this is David Chen from Financial Tribune. I'm calling for comment on a story I'm running about offshore banking irregularities at Blackstone Financial. Marcus had hung up immediately, but the damage was done. Chen had been sniffing around for months, asking questions about shell companies and client relationships that no journalist should know about. Someone was feeding him information. Someone with access. His desk phone buzzed. Mr. Sterling, Sarah Mitchell is here for your 3 o'clock. Send her in. Sarah entered with her usual bright smile, but Marcus noticed the subtle changes immediately. The way she hesitated before sitting down, the slight stiffness in her posture, the careful distance she maintained from his desk. Sir, I wanted to discuss the Hartwell acquisition proposal. I've been reviewing the financial projections, and some of the offshore structuring seems, she paused, choosing her words carefully, aggressive. There it was, the first crack in the foundation he'd spent months building. Marcus had seen this before, the moment when blind loyalty gave way to uncomfortable questions. It always started with the smart ones, the ones with enough intelligence to eventually see through the carefully constructed facade. Aggressive? How? He kept his voice level. The Cayman Islands entities seemed designed more for tax avoidance than operational efficiency, and some of the client relationships. Sarah's voice trailed off as she met his eyes. Mr. Sterling, are we operating within legal guidelines? The question hung between them like an accusation. Marcus had faced regulatory inquiries, internal audits, even hostile takeovers, but nothing felt as dangerous as the doubt in his protégé's eyes. Sarah, you're thinking like an academic rather than a practitioner. He moved around the desk, close enough to invoke the old dynamic of mentor and student. The financial world operates in shades of gray. What matters isn't whether something appears aggressive to outside observers, but whether it delivers results for our client. Sarah didn't retreat, but she didn't lean into his presence either. What about Elena Rodriguez? The name hit like a physical blow. Marcus felt his careful mask slip for just a moment before reassembling itself. What about her? I heard she used to work here. Left suddenly about 3 years ago. There were rumors. There are always rumors. Sarah, unsuccessful employees often create narratives to explain their failures. Marcus returned to his chair, putting the desk between them again. Elena Rodriguez lacked the mental fortitude for this business. Not everyone is cut out for the pressures we face. Is that what happened to Rachel Davidson too? The second name was like a knife between his ribs. Marcus had spent 2 years congratulating himself on Rachel's destruction, watching from afar as she struggled to rebuild what he'd torn down. But lately her name had been appearing in contexts that made him uncomfortable. Client poach, strategic partnerships with firms that should have been Blackstone allies, whispered conversations that died when he entered rooms. Where are you hearing these names, Sarah? People talk, Mr. Sterling. The industry isn't as big as it seems. Sarah's voice had lost its deferential quality. I'm starting to wonder if there's a pattern here. Talented women who work closely with you, then suddenly disappear from the industry. Marcus felt the walls closing in. Sarah had been his insurance policy, his proof that he could nurture female talent. Now she was becoming another liability, another loose thread that could unravel everything. I think you should take some time off, he said carefully. You seem stressed. The summit preparations have been demanding on all of us. Actually, I've been thinking the same thing. Sarah stood, her composure intact but her warmth completely gone. I'll be taking a leave of absence, effective immediately. She left without another word, taking with her years of careful cultivation, and leaving behind the bitter taste of another relationship turned sour. Marcus stared at the door for a long moment, then reached for his phone. Get me Richard Sterling. His brother's office was only 20 minutes away, but it felt like crossing enemy territory. Richard had been avoiding his calls for a week, claiming client emergencies and family obligations. When Marcus finally arrived at Sterling and Associates, he found his brother waiting with an expression that mixed resignation with something that might have been pity. Marcus, I wondered when you'd show up. We need to talk. Marcus closed the office door behind him, noting how Richard tensed at the gesture. About your recent visitors, I meet with potential clients all the time. Rachel Davidson isn't a potential client. She's a Marcus moved to the window, studying the modest view that Richard seemed to prefer over the commanding vistas available to more successful firms. What did she want? Richard was quiet for a long moment, his wedding ring catching the afternoon light as he twisted it unconsciously, a tell Marcus had learned to read decades ago. She wanted to warn me about you. The honesty was unexpected, disarming. Marcus had prepared for denials, deflections, the kind of family loyalty that had sustained them through 40 years of brotherhood. He hadn't prepared for this quiet acceptance of his guilt. And did you believe her? I wanted not to. Richard's voice carried the weight of a lifetime of difficult truths. But then I started looking closer at our shared clients, at the financial structures you've been recommending. Marcus, what have you done? The question contained no anger, only a profound sadness that cut deeper than any accusation. Marcus saw himself reflected in his brother's eyes, not the successful predator he'd imagined himself to be, but something smaller and more desperate. I've built an empire, Marcus said finally. I've created opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. I've made us both wealthy beyond our childhood dreams. At what cost? The simple question deserved a simple answer, but Marcus found himself unable to provide one. The cost had been calculated in ways that didn't translate to balance sheets. Trust destroyed, lives derailed, a reputation built on the bones of other people's careers. You're going to cut ties with me, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. The shared accounts, the joint ventures, the client referrals, all of it ends now. Richard opened a file drawer and pulled out a stack of legal documents. I've already started the process. By next week, Sterling and Associates will have no financial connection to you or Blackstone Financial. Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. Richard had been his anchor to legitimacy, his proof that success could coexist with decency. Without that connection, he was truly alone. This is Rachel Davidson's doing. She's turned you against me. No, Marcus, this is your doing. Rachel just helped me see what I'd been ignoring for years. Richard stood and moved to his desk, his movements deliberate and final. I love you, you're my brother, and that will never change, but I can't be complicit in what you've become. The drive back to Blackstone Financial passed in a blur of rage and calculation. Marcus had built his career on reading people, on understanding their weaknesses, and exploiting them with surgical precision, but somehow his world was crumbling despite his expertise. Rachel Davidson, his former protégé, his discarded creation, had outmaneuvered him. Back in his office, Marcus opened his laptop and began typing with the focused intensity of a man fighting for his life. If Rachel wanted a war, she would get one, but she'd forgotten the most important lesson he'd ever taught her in the world of high finance. There were no rules except victory and defeat. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he crafted emails to industry contacts, spinning narratives about Davidson Walsh Consulting's aggressive tactics and questionable client relationship. He leaked confidential information about Rachel's investigation to friendly journalists, painting her as a bitter ex-employee with an axe to grind. But even as he deployed his weapons, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was fighting a battle that had already been lost. The walls weren't just closing in, they were collapsing, and he was running out of ways to shore them up. In 1 week at the Financial Leaders Summit, he would face an audience of his peers knowing that among them sat enemies whose faces he couldn't identify. The summit that should have been his triumph was becoming his execution. Marcus Sterling poured himself a scotch as the Manhattan skyline darkened around him, the city lights twinkling like stars in a hostile universe. He'd spent his career believing that intelligence and ruthlessness were enough to overcome any obstacle. He was about to discover how wrong a man could be. The scotch burned his throat as he raised a toast to the empty office. To my creation, he whispered to the shadow. May she prove worthy. Rachel's phone buzzed at 2:47 a.m., dragging her from a fitful sleep, filled with dreams of collapsing towers and burning bridges. David's name glowed on the screen, urgent and unexpected. Rachel, you need to see this. Now, David, it's almost 3 in the morning. Check your email. I'm sending you something that changes everything. Still groggy, Rachel padded to her home office and opened her laptop. David's email contained a single attachment, a A leaked internal memo from Blackstone Financial dated just 6 hours ago. As she read, her blood turned to ice. The question hit like a physical blow. Rachel could have pushed harder, could have found a way to make Sarah listen. Instead, she'd let her pride and her need for secrecy take precedence over Sarah's safety. Because I was more concerned with my revenge than your protection, Rachel admitted, and that makes me almost as guilty as he is. They sat in silence for a moment, two women who'd been broken by the same man, separated by years but united by trauma. There's something else, Sarah said finally, something I found in Marcus's files before I quit, financial records that don't match what he gave the auditors. Proof that the money laundering goes back further than anyone realizes. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a flash drive. I copied everything before I left. Bank records, client communications, internal memos, if what you said at the gala is true. If there are other women he's hurt, maybe this can help them. Rachel stared at the drive as if it were a live grenade. Sarah, if you give this to me, there's no going back. You'll be part of this war whether you want to be or not. I'm already part of it. The moment I started asking questions, I became his enemy. Sarah pressed the drive into Rachel's hand. At least this way. I go down fighting instead of running. A sound from the front of the apartment made them both freeze. Footsteps in the hallway, stopping outside Sarah's door. Then came the sound of a key turning in the lock. Shit, Sarah whispered. I gave Marcus a spare key months ago. Emergency access, he said. In case something happened. Rachel felt her heart hammering as the front door opened and closed. Heavy footsteps moved through the apartment, methodical and searching. They were trapped. Is there another way out? Rachel whispered. Sarah pointed toward the bathroom window, a narrow opening that led to an air shaft between buildings. It would be a tight fit, and the drop to the alley below was at least 15 feet. The footsteps were getting closer, pausing at the bedroom door. Rachel could hear Marcus's voice, low and measured, probably talking on his phone. Sarah, I know you're here. Your doorman was very helpful after I explained how worried I was about my missing protégé. Rachel and Sarah looked at each other, years of conditioning making them both want to respond to that familiar voice of authority. But the spell was broken now. The illusion of benevolent mentorship stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. We go together, Rachel whispered. On 3, they climbed through the bathroom window just as Marcus's footsteps reached the bathroom door. The air shaft was narrow and dark, filled with the smell of garbage and decades of urban decay. They hung from the window ledge for a moment, Sarah's apartment glowing behind them like a beacon of everything they were leaving behind. Jump, Rachel said, and they fell together into the uncertain darkness of the alley below. They landed hard on a pile of construction debris, Sarah crying out as her ankle twisted beneath her. But they were alive and they were free, and clutched in Rachel's hand was the evidence that could bring down the empire. Marcus Sterling had built on the bones of broken dreams. Above them, a light came on in Sarah's bathroom window. Marcus's silhouette appeared briefly, looking down into the alley where they'd landed. Even from this distance, Rachel could feel his rage. The war had begun in earnest now. There would be no more shadows, no more carefully orchestrated moves from behind the scenes. In 3 days, at the Financial Leaders Summit, the final battle would be fought in full view of the industry that had made them all. As they limped toward the street, Sarah supporting herself on Rachel's shoulder, Rachel felt the weight of the flash drive in her pocket. It contained the ammunition to destroy Marcus Sterling completely. The question was whether she still had enough humanity left to use it wisely. Rachel's scheme. Rachel watched Marcus's face as someone in the front row held up their tablet for him to see. His composure cracked for just a moment, a flash of panic quickly masked by practiced calm, but she knew him well enough to read the tells, the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible pause before he continued speaking. As I was saying, Marcus pressed on, his voice projecting confidence even as his world crumbled in real time. The foundation of any successful financial institution. Mr. Sterling, a voice called out from the audience. Rachel recognized the reporter from Wall Street Journal, one of the journalists David had strategically briefed the night before. Would you care to comment on allegations that you've been laundering money through Cayman Islands shell company? The ballroom fell silent, except for the soft clicking of phone cameras, recording what would become Marcus Sterling's professional obituary. He stood at the podium like a man facing a firing squad. His carefully prepared speech forgot. I'm afraid I don't comment on baseless allegations from disgruntled former employees, Marcus said, but his voice lacked its usual commanding resonance. Now, if we could return to the matter at hand, what about Elena Rodriguez? Another voice, another report. Are you denying the sexual harassment allegations detailed in her sworn affidavit? Rachel felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. Elena had kept her word, despite her fear. The affidavit had been filed with the SEC that morning, timed to coincide with David's article. Every detail of Marcus's abuse was now part of the public record. Marcus's mask finally slipped completely. This is clearly a coordinated attack by individuals with personal vendettas. I will not dignify these fabrications with a He turned to leave the stage, but Thomas Blackstone was already rising from his seat in the front row. The founding partner moved with the measured pace of a man who'd been preparing for this moment for months. Marcus, perhaps you should remain available for questions, Thomas said, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's excellent acoustics. As your business partner, I'm quite interested in these allegations myself. The betrayal was exquisite in its timing. Marcus found himself trapped on stage, abandoned by his mentor and surrounded by an industry that was already calculating the distance they needed to put between themselves and the scandal. Rachel had seen enough corporate executions to recognize the rhythm, the shocked silence, the frantic phone calls, the subtle repositioning, as former allies became strangers. Marcus's eyes swept the crowd, searching for friendly faces and finding none. When his gaze finally found Rachel in the back row, she saw something she'd never expected to see in those pale gray eyes: genuine fear. Their stare held for a long moment, predator and prey finally face to face across the wreckage of his empire. Rachel felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a hollow recognition that this moment, which she'd fantasized about for 2 years, felt nothing like victory. Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas Blackstone's voice cut through the chaos. I believe this panel requires a brief recess. Mr. Sterling, perhaps we could continue this discussion in private. The ballroom erupted as Marcus was escorted off stage by security personnel who'd materialized from nowhere. Rachel remained seated as the crowd dispersed around her, journalists rushing toward exits to file their stories, industry executives clustering in worried groups to assess the damage to their own reputations. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Where are you? The office is being swarmed by reporters asking about your role in this. Rachel closed her eyes. She'd known this moment would come, when her careful orchestration would be exposed, when she'd have to face the consequences of her 2-year campaign. The anonymous tips, the strategic leaks, the cultivation of sources, all of it would eventually be traced back to her. Quite a show. Rachel opened her eyes to find Richard Sterling standing beside her chair. Marcus's brother looked older than he had just a week ago, worn down by the weight of family loyalty and moral obligation. I'm sorry, she said, surprised by how much she meant it. About your family, about what this will do to them. Richard sat down beside her, his movements heavy with exhaustion. Are you, or is this exactly what you wanted to destroy everything he touched, including the people who loved him despite his flaws? The question cut deep, because it contained just enough truth to... Rachel had known that Marcus's downfall would devastate his family, but she'd convinced herself that justice required sacrifices. Your brother is a predator, she said quietly. How many more women would he have hurt if I'd done nothing? You're probably right. Richard's admission surprised her, but that doesn't make what you've done noble, Rachel. Justice isn't supposed to feel like revenge. Before she could respond, her phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen. The SEC is opening a formal investigation, he said without preamble. Elena's testimony was the catalyst they needed. They're freezing Blackstone's offshore accounts pending a full audit. Rachel felt a strange numbness settle over her. She'd accomplished everything she'd set out to do. Marcus was destroyed, his crimes exposed, his victims vindicated. So why did she feel so empty? There's something else, David continued. Sarah Mitchell is safe. I helped her get a lawyer, and she's agreed to cooperate with the investigation. Her evidence is going to be crucial for the RICO charges. RICO charges, racketeering, the kind of federal prosecution that could put Marcus away for decades. Rachel had gotten her revenge and then some. Rachel, are you there? I'm here. She watched through the ballroom windows as news vans assembled on the street below, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like mechanical flowers seeking sun. David, I need to ask you something. When this is all over, when Marcus is in prison, and the investigation is closed, what happens to us? The question hung in the digital space between them. David was quiet for a long moment before answering. I don't know. You've accomplished something remarkable here. Exposed corruption, protected future victims, brought justice to women who'd been silenced. But you've also spent 2 years becoming someone I'm not sure I recognize. The honesty was brutal and necessary. Rachel had become so focused on destroying Marcus that she'd forgotten to consider who she was becoming in the process. I need to go, she said. Jennifer's dealing with reporters and I should. Rachel, David's voice stopped. For what it's worth, I think the woman I first met, the one who believed in justice over revenge, is still in there somewhere. But you're going to have to decide if you want to find her again. The call ended, leaving Rachel alone in the emptying ballroom. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the city continuing its relentless pace, indifferent to the human dramas playing out in its towers of glass and steel. Marcus Sterling was finished. His empire was crumbling, his crimes exposed, his victims finally free to speak their truth. She'd gotten everything she'd wanted and more. So why did victory taste so much like ash? Rachel stood and walked toward the exit, her heels echoing in the vast space. Outside, reporters waited with cameras and microphones, ready to document her role in Marcus Sterling's downfall. The woman who'd orchestrated his destruction would finally step out of the shadows. The question was whether she'd emerge as a hero, or a cautionary tale about the price of revenge. As she reached for the door handle, Rachel caught her reflection in the polished brass. The woman staring back at her looked successful, powerful, victorious, but her eyes held something that looked disturbingly like the emptiness she'd once seen in Marcus Sterling's gaze. The door opened onto a storm of camera flashes and shouted questions. Rachel squared her shoulders and stepped into the light, ready to face the consequences of becoming everything she'd once despised. Behind her, the ballroom stood empty except for the lingering echoes of dreams destroyed and empires fallen. The reckoning had begun, but the final accounting was yet to come. Rachel found Marcus Sterling sitting alone in the Waldorf's deserted Peacock Alley lounge, nursing a scotch that had long since gone warm. The ornate bar that usually buzzed with deal-makers and power brokers was empty except for a lone bartender who studiously avoided eye contact. Even the hotel staff could sense the toxicity radiating from the man who'd been Manhattan's golden boy just 6 hours earlier. He looked up as she approached, his gray eyes holding none of their usual predatory gleam. For the first time since she'd known him, Marcus Sterling looked exactly what he was, a 62-year-old man, whose carefully constructed world had collapsed in a single morning. Rachel. Her name on his lips carried no venom, no manipulation, just exhaustion. I wondered when you'd come to gloat. She slid into the chair across from him, noting the tremor in his hands as he lifted his glass. The expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled. He looked like a king who'd just watched his kingdom burn. I'm not here to gloat. Then why are you here? Marcus's voice held genuine curiosity, as if he couldn't fathom any other reason for her presence. You've won, completely, thoroughly, brilliant. The student has surpassed the teacher in ways I never imagined possible. The words should have felt like vindication, but they sat in Rachel's chest like stones. I came to understand something, to figure out why this doesn't feel like victory. Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Because it isn't victory, Rachel. It's mutual destruction. You've spent 2 years becoming exactly what you hated about me, and now you're discovering that winning a war against monsters requires becoming one yourself. I'm nothing like you, aren't you? Marcus set down his glass and leaned forward, his voice taking on the pedagogical tone that had once made her feel special. You manipulated David Chen, using his feelings for you to turn him into a weapon. You exploited Elena Rodriguez's trauma, convincing a broken woman to relive her worst nightmare for your benefit. You turned my own brother against me through carefully calculated emotional manipulation. Each accusation hit like a physical blow because they were true. Rachel had done all of those things, justified them as necessary sacrifices in pursuit of justice, but hearing them catalogued so clinically, she couldn't ignore what she'd become. They chose to help me, she said weakly. Did they? Or did you present their choices in such a way that helping you felt like their only option? Marcus's smile was bitter. That's my signature move, Rachel. I taught it to you, and you perfected it beyond my wildest dreams. The lounge felt suddenly claustrophobic. Rachel could smell the ghosts of 1,000 power lunches, 1,000 deals that had shaped Manhattan's financial landscape. How many of those conversations had been built on the same kind of manipulation she'd employed? You destroyed innocent people, she said, grasping for moral high ground. Elena, Sarah, me, we were just trying to build careers, and you destroyed my family. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. Richard's children will grow up knowing their uncle is a criminal. My nephew asked me last Christmas if I was going to teach him about money when he got older. What do you think he'll ask me now? The image hit Rachel unexpectedly hard. She'd never considered Marcus's family as real people, only as collateral damage in her war. But somewhere in Connecticut, an 8-year-old boy was probably wondering why Uncle Marcus wouldn't be coming to dinner anymore. They deserve better than you, she said, but the conviction was leaking from her voice. They do, just like David Chen deserves better than someone who used his love as a weapon. Just like Elena Rodriguez deserved better than being forced to choose between helping you and protecting her own peace of mind. Marcus finished his scotch in one swallow. We're both toxic, Rachel. The only difference is that I've accepted what I am. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of acknowledged truths. Rachel felt something fundamental shifting inside her chest, not the righteous anger that had sustained her for 2 years, but something darker and more complicated. What happens now? She asked.